Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Today, we're going to be talking about immutable variables and how they operate with functions. So when we create a variable doesn't actually store the data that we assign to it. A variable is a reference to a location in memory where the value is stored. So the variable itself, when we create a variable, that doesn't store anything. All that's doing is pointing to a location in memory, and that's where the value is stored. So when we pass a variable into a function, there's two different types of variables we pass in: immutable or mutable. Mutable variables are not affected by changes that we make within the function. When we pass an immutable variable into a function and we make a change to the value of that variable, back where we called the function, that variable is not going to have been changed. The variable we passed into that function is not going to be changed. I'll show you an example of this in just a second. Mutable variables, on the other hand, may change the value of the variable, may have their values changed when we pass them into a function. And some mutable variables, and we'll go into more depth in our next lecture on this one, but mutable variables are lists and dictionaries primarily. There's a few others, but those are the primary ones that we have in Python that we're going to talk about. So let's take a look here at an example. So here's what happens when we have this variable num and we give it the value 45. We have this variable name num that is stored, and it's pointing to a location in memory where its value is stored. Notice that those are separate from each other though. So the reference, which is that arrow that you see right here in the middle, is just saying that this name num is pointing to this location that stores the value 45. Okay. Now, as I mentioned, immutable objects cannot be changed. This doesn't matter if we're talking about functions or not. If we create an immutable variable, the value never changes. That means that if we reassign a new value to that variable, what we're actually doing is changing the reference and having the variable point to a new location in memory. Some immutable objects that we have: strings, ints, floats, tuples. These are some of the variables: strings, ints, and floats we've already talked about. And these can't change. Now, I know this was happening behind the scenes, so it didn't really make a difference so far, but you're going to see this difference when I show you an example with functions. So let's just take a look here. Again, no functions yet. We have two lines of code. Num equals 45 is the first one. Well, what's going to happen there is this variable num is going to point to a location in memory where we get the value 45 stored there. The next line of code says num equals 81. Now, you might think that what would happen is that we just replace the 45 in that location of memory with 81, but in fact, that's not what happens. Instead, a brand new location of memory is used. We store the value 81 and change the reference of where num is pointing. So num changes to point to a new location in memory. That's what happens with immutable objects. So we don't just change the value in that location of where the variable is pointing, but instead you create a new value that goes into a new location in memory and change where the variable is pointing. Okay, so that's how immutable variables work. So what happens when we pass an immutable object into a function? Well, what happens is that a copy is made. So we actually will copy the value into, the variable, and we have two different objects that are both now pointing at that location. Let's take a look here. An example will hopefully clear this up for us. So on the left-hand side, you see that we have this arg equals 25. So we get this variable arg pointing at a location in memory where it gets the value 25. We then pass this variable arg into this function, my function. Okay, now when we pass that in, the variable arg is passed into a new variable called param. Now param is part of the namespace. The scope of that variable is inside my function. We don't have access to param anywhere else. It's only in my function that we have access to that. So this variable param is then going to be placed in the my function namespace within the scope of my function, and it just points to the same location in memory though. So now we have two different variables that are both pointing at the same location in memory. Okay, when we print out param inside of my function, it'll print 25. When we come back to our original function that called it and we print arg, it will also print 25. But now this is where it gets interesting and where you're going to see a difference between mutable and immutable objects. What happens if my function changes the value of that variable? Okay, so let's walk through this again. We've got arg equals 25, and it's pointing at a location of memory where 25 is stored. It calls my function, passes arg in for param. So param is now pointing at the same location where it's got the value 25 stored. But then the first line inside my function is changing the value of param. What is that going to do? It doesn't change the value that it's pointing at. Remember, the variable is immutable. Since the variable is immutable, you don't change the value, but you create a new value in a new location in memory, and you change where the variable is pointing. But take note of something here. Arg did not change the pointer. All that we did from this line of code is we changed what param is pointing to. So param is now pointing to a new location in memory where it gets its new value, 32. Now, when we print param on the next line of code right here, we're going to print 32. When we come back, though, and when we return from my function, we come back here and we print arg. Notice that arg is still pointing at 25. So what we're going to get in this, if we looked at our output, is we would get 32 followed by 25. So the value of arg didn't change, and that is what's special about immutable variables and why you need to understand which ones are immutable compared to which ones are mutable. Our next lecture here, we're going to talk about mutable variables and how those differ from immutable variables.